This is Kelly Nielsen, the Grief Guru, and on this channel, we discuss all things related to grief. What does it look like? What does it feel like? But most importantly, we share tips, tools, and resources on how to move through grief and get back to living a life that you love. So certainly, if you find this video helpful, click the like or subscribe button in order to get more helpful tips. But in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the difference between grief and mourning. Turns out that those are actually two completely different things. And in fact, one is the solution to the other. This was a surprise to me in my studies because we've always used those words grief and mourning sort of interchangeably in our culture. There's also a lot of thoughts about the effects of grief and that grief can never end. And what I found in my studies is that mourning, the process of mourning and leaning into it and doing it well, actually resolves grief. See, grief is the internal effects. It's the internal feelings and sorrow and emotions and even physical effects. Those things, those internal effects of loss is described as grief, where mourning is the outward process and processing of the loss. I think that's a problem with a lot of folks that are dealing with loss, is that they recognize the grief, they verbalize the grief, they're stuck in the grief, but they don't really embrace a process of mourning in order to resolve the grief or reconcile the grief. And mourning for me really is made up of three parts. First of all, mourning, the process of mourning means closing the loop or finding some sense of closure on any unfinished business between you and your loved one. That may be conversations that never were concluded. That may be unforgiveness, things that you needed to forgive the person for, or maybe you were hoping to receive forgiveness from them. It can be unresolved debts or just any unfinished business that you have with the person. It's really important for you to go through and acknowledge those places that seem unclosed, those places that seem unfinished, and have resolution to that. A lot of folks will write a letter or talk with a friend or a counselor in order to work through those issues that weren't resolved in your mind. The second part of mourning really involves acknowledging the loss and celebrating the life of the person that you lost. There's kind of two pieces of that. It's just recognizing that this person is gone, their life here on earth is complete. And they all, no matter how long they were here, they had a journey, they had things that they contributed. And so taking time to reflect on and to remember and celebrate and honor the life that they lived is a really important part of the mourning process. And also recognizing, verbalizing, and processing the hole that's been created in your life, the thing that's going to be missing, whatever their relationship was to you, just acknowledging that, you know, your spouse, your child, your sibling, whoever it was, shared a place in your life and in your schedule and in your heart, and just acknowledging that that season has in fact ended, that day-to-day conversation or them being here physically anyways, that season is over, and processing that and coming to a place of acceptance of that, just the realization of that. And then the third part of mourning is really forward focused. And after you've, closed the loop and you've celebrated and really come to grips with the fact that that season is over, then the last part is really beginning to look forward and to begin to think about what your life is going to look like going forward. And most importantly, what you want your life to look like going forward. All of these steps are included in mourning. But as I mentioned earlier, I think a lot of people label it as grief, and they're afflicted by grief and they're affected by grief, but they never really enter into the process of mourning. So let's talk a little bit about grief. And so you can see if you are having some of these symptoms or some of these things are happening in your life, and maybe, just maybe, you haven't fully mourned the loss. And maybe that's the thing that you need to lean into. Grief can show up physically, certainly. Feelings of fatigue, feelings of lack of concentration, really heavy waves of sorrow, not being able to eat, not being able to sleep, feeling lonely, feeling uncertain. Grief can show up in so many different ways, but the purpose of this video is to help us shift and understand that grief is just the signs of grief happening in our body and in our lives is a symptom, is the sign. Our body and our heart are speaking to us loudly that we need to enter the process of mourning. And I think especially in the USA, we don't really mourn well. We don't talk about mourning. We don't do it as a culture, as a society. You know, we have the funeral and then everyone goes back to their life. And that was actually part of the process that was so unsettling in my journey, is that, you know, a couple of weeks after the loss happens, everybody goes back to their life, and it feels offensive. It feels isolating. It can feel incredibly lonely. You know, a lot of different countries and cultures have all sorts of traditions around mourning. You know, there are several countries where the family will mourn for an entire year after the person passes away, and they'll wear black or they'll do different things. And in a lot of cultures, they actually have a second celebration or a second celebration of life, or kind of memorial service after it's been a year, to just acknowledge that you've been through an entire year, all the major holidays and everything, with the absence of your loved one. And I'm not presuming or proposing that we should adopt that in our culture. What I am saying is I think that we don't do mourning well as a culture. And I definitely think that if you're struggling with grief, if you're finding that you're having all of these physical effects and a hard time overcoming it, that maybe, just maybe, you need to enter into a season of mourning. You need to go through a process of mourning in order to get closure and reconcile some of those unmet needs and unanswered questions, in order to move forward powerfully and purposefully. You know, the Bible talks about it quite a few places, and actually it talks about mourning, that we're all called to mourning, but the Bible refers to grief as being a sickness, a condition in your body that can settle in. See, grief can become permanent, but mourning is a process. Mourning is intended to have a beginning, middle, and end. It's intended to be a process that you go through in order to resolve grief. I think another thing that's just compounding all of this is that our world that we're living in today, we are being bombarded with trauma and news, and so much is going on. We are ill-equipped to handle our normal everyday lives without trying to tackle extreme loss and tragedy. I mean, grief and losing a loved one, grief, mourning, and losing a loved one is one of the hardest, if not the hardest, things that we face in our life. And now, with the season that we're in and everything that's happening in the world, it makes it that much harder. So for that reason, you need to, even more so, really carve out time and really put a hedge of protection around yourself and your heart and your mind. I really encourage people who are going through a mourning process and really working through to resolve the feelings of grief to be somewhat secluded from social media and news, and just really do an inventory and audit. That's part of what we work with our clients in Grief Relief Nation, is to do an intensive audit of all the things in their surrounding and really determine for themselves what is helpful to them and what is hurtful to them during this season of recovery and during this season of mourning. So I hope today you found this video helpful. If you're looking for some suggestions on how where do we begin with mourning, I encourage you to get our grief survival guide. That's a great place to start, or hop into our free community on Facebook at Unstuck Life on Facebook. We would love to see you there. Certainly subscribe for other videos and tips, and I'm cheering you on every step of the way to get back to living a life that you love. Until next time.